Welcome to the Latter-day Contemplation Presents Come Follow Me podcast. I'm your co-host, Abdul Haq, also known as Christopher Hurtado. I'm also co-host of the Latter-day Peace Studies Presents Come Follow Me and Latter-day Contemplation podcasts. In this podcast, I'm joined by my co-host and Sufi master, Sufi Al-Hajj Dawood, also known as Dr. David Peck. Dr. Peck is also the host of the Of Saints and Sufis, Musings of a Mormon Mystic podcast. On this podcast, we're sharing an actual master-disciple dialogue on Scripture with little to no editing.
I'm your co-host, Sufi Al-Hajj Dawood, also known as Dr. David Peck. The Sufi path is a spiritual, mystical, and contemplative practice often described as a journey. Universal Sufism is not a religion. Rather, Universal Sufism is a spiritual path that welcomes persons of all religions, or no religion at all. Our path is open to all, welcomes all, loves all. Sufi scripture study begins with a de-educational process that speaks directly to the souls of saints and Sufis and their scriptures. This study sets aside mere ethical or doctrinal readings through what Sufis call unlearning. This Sufi mystical approach enables one to see the scriptures afresh through spiritual eyes.
We invite you to join our unfolding dialogue.
Let the journey begin.
Assalamu alaikum, ya Sheikh al-Karim. It's good to be with you, Master.
Wa alaikum assalamu ya Abdul Haq. Peace be upon you. It's good to be with you.
This week you've chosen the verses we're going to cover out of the Come Follow Me reading, and those verses come from Galatians, and you chose 16 through 5, 16 through 18.
That's correct. Chapter 5, verses 16 through 18.
Why did you choose these verses?
That's a great question, because there's so much in the book of Galatians. There's many aspects of it that are wonderful. And but I wanted to, I chose something that has a very strong Sufi, I believe, sense to it and message to it, very mystical. And I thought it would give us a chance to talk about one of the more important aspects of Sufism, which is coming to understand our own soul, or what in the past I've called the self-revelation, or the self-revelation of the soul to the ego. And I think that helps us, this set of scriptures helps us explore those mystical concepts.
Is that different from the revelation of the divine?
Yes. In fact, the word I was looking for earlier is one that Sufis often use, which is self-disclosure. In other words, revelation in that sense is a process of that which is being revealed discloses itself to something. And so it's a voluntary act by either the divine disclosing itself to us or my soul disclosing myself to my ego. And so it has a sort of intimacy to it. It's not something that can be forced, but instead is something that we can seek.
I had a surprise moment where I experienced this last night, where I just looked in the mirror and saw my ego self in the mirror. I realized it was my ego self in the mirror, not myself, not my soul.
Yeah, mirrors. We've talked about this a little bit before. The mirror is a metaphor, and why not literally a metaphor for the ego self, which can only be understood with our senses, principally the sense of sight, of course, and that we see things backwards in a mirror, right? Everything around us and behind us. It's why we have trouble sometimes getting ourselves prepared to go out into the world in the mirror. It's they're considered a metaphor for deceit, not a metaphor for revelation.
Would you like me to read the verses you chose, or would you like to read them?
Yeah, why don't you read them?
Okay. This is again Galatians 5, 16 through 18 in the NRSV translation. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. I was with it until you are not subject to the law.
Yeah, well, that doesn't sound like something we would hear in church. I doubt we'd think, well, will everybody open up to Galatians 5, verse 18? And I want to announce to you, none of you are subject any longer to the law. I don't think that. So we have to understand what Paul's saying, because I think that's a curious way of putting it. Let's take a minute maybe and go through the unlearning process. Was there anything you read that you would like to bring out as a phrase or a word or something that strikes you as something you'd like to explore a little bit more by maybe unlearning what we think we know about it and revisiting it anew?
Well, there's living by the Spirit. There's the desires of the Spirit as opposed to the desires of the flesh. There's gratifying the desires of the flesh. There's doing what you want. And then, of course, not being subject to the law.
Yeah, yeah. That's in fact, I guess, yeah, prevent you from doing what you want. And I think that's what you were saying there. That's a strange phrase. Do you want to give your comments, your thoughts on any of these before I start into some of my own thoughts?
There is something that comes up. That is the idea that following after one's own desires, doing what one wants, rather than being subject to the law, as I would say, where that's going to be a little bit tricky now because we have to figure out what that says, right, or what that means. But I would think of following my own desires as, or doing what I want, as something different from doing what the divine would want me to do, or following the law from the divine. And I would think of it in Sufi terms, in terms of ghafla, in terms of heedlessness, not heeding the law.
Yeah, heedlessness, distractedness. Well, yeah, and I think that let's maybe try to take a couple of those phrases, you from doing what you want, and you are not subject to the law. I think if we took this in as a literal phrase, that Paul would seem very confusing to us. It sounds like he's saying, when you do what the Spirit desires, there's nothing to prevent you from doing what you want. If that's we want to do things then that are contrary to what God says, then that would make no sense. And we use the phrase, I want to do what I want to do. I can do what I want. And I don't think that's quite what's being said here. And so just for a second, point back to the language in verse 17 where Paul says, for what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. And so this doing what you want, seems to be contained with or contextualized by the opposition between the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit. So I think we need to understand it within that context.
It seems then that assuming that the flesh and the Spirit that are spoken of in these verses are both my own spirit and my own flesh, that somehow there's some kind of division going on between me, that there are these two parts of me. I think we accept that, right? The idea that there are two parts of us, our spirit and our body.
Yeah, I think that we do have that notion, don't we, that we're made up of parts, and in fact there may be two of them. Certainly this idea of opposition in all things is very much in a key concept within LDS theology. And so we do want to explore that just a little bit, the flesh and the Spirit. And of course, Paul's using language that helps us understand there's two parts to us and that they are in opposition. So this idea of living by the Spirit then how would that come to bear upon the opposition between the flesh and the spirit? You're mentioning just briefly. You mentioned that that you were saying that there seems to be a division within you if he's talking about you, but I think he is talking about us individually, because the opening statement is for us to live by the Spirit. So, at any rate, if you would maybe share some observations you might have on that.
Well, it seems again that there's some kind of conflict between my spirit and my flesh. That's the sense I get. And I've experienced that in some sense, at least that's what I've been told. I'm looking for further insight.
Okay, yeah. So you seem to sense this notion of living by the flesh and hopefully living by the Spirit as well. It seems to me if Paul is going to say, as he does in verse 16, live by the Spirit, and then goes on to say, I say, live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh, that you can live by either one.
Something else occurs to me. It's the idea that, so I've been talking about my spirit and my flesh being in opposition to each other. This could also be read as following the Spirit, as in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost, right? Versus following my own desires.
Yeah, I think so. And
Which
so,
is it?
but, well, see, that's a great question, don't you think? Because if we say live by the Holy Spirit, and in the text as it's printed in the NRSV, Spirit is capitalized, it's capital S, and throughout this, it seems to be indicating like a title, like the Holy Spirit, and not the flesh. Well, that would reduce us to flesh. But
So there
how
goes my
would
spirit, right? Meaning,
Well,
if it's
that's
the capital S Spirit versus my flesh, then I'm only flesh, and where's my spirit? And it's
right.
also confusing again that if I were following the Spirit with a capital S, I wouldn't be subject to the law.
Okay, well, see, and that then it begins to get very confused, right? It's almost like saying that there's some outward force, and if you follow it, then the law doesn't apply to you anymore, and furthermore, the idea that we're nothing but flesh, that this opposition isn't within us, that the opposition is somehow between an external force and our fleshly nature, and so I'm just going to say that I think the translators put the capital S on there. I don't think the capital S is in the text. It doesn't say the Holy Spirit.
You took the words right out of my mouth. That's where I was going to go. It occurred to me that perhaps this capitalization is out of place, and that it makes more sense the way we were thinking about it and the way I was talking about it. It's my spirit and my flesh in opposition to each other, and some kind of internal conflict. But it's still confusing that if I were to somehow follow my own spirit rather than my own flesh, that I wouldn't be subject to the law. I would think of following the Spirit as the same as being subject to the law.
Well, let's go ahead then. I think we've worked through these phrases a little bit, and the reason I think it's not a capital S too is in the end of verse 17, right, where it says to prevent you from doing what you want. Well, if doing what you want is your fleshly nature, and there's this external spirit that's trying to tell you not to do any of these things, then I think that Paul's logic, his internal logic, begins to collapse, right? Because is not being subject to the law mean you do what you want in that worldly sense, in the fleshly sense? If what we are by nature is the flesh, and we don't have the spirit, we don't have spirit in us, then these verses begin to be convoluted by me. I think we lose track maybe what Paul's getting at.
Master, I've often felt while reading Paul that his logic is convoluted. Now I'm holding out hope that, and I consider myself a careful reader, and yet I'm holding out hope that there's more depth to this than what I can see, that you'll show me.
Well, we'll talk about it. I hope it becomes clarified. Paul was difficult for me. We've talked about that too when I was young, and yet I saw something in it that attracted me, And so, as you know, I decided to spend the last year of my mission. My personal study time was reading Paul in Spanish so that I could unlearn, in the sense of I couldn't read him in the familiar English, or I wouldn't read him for that time in the familiar English, and I had to meet the text anew through another language. And I felt like that was a big breakthrough. What we're doing here, as you know, with our unlearning is getting a new lens, so that a lens we all have, even if we don't have a second language.
That's one of the reasons I also read the text in other languages. And it's also one of the reasons I read the NRSV translation. Is that one of the reasons you chose it?
Yeah, well, yes, it is one of the reasons. There's many translations I love. The NRSV is a great translation. I like the English Standard Version, the ESV. There's all kinds of different versions that I take a look at sometimes when I want to get a different impression. I have a book around here someplace. It's called the Precise Parallel New Testament, that will give like 8 translations and the Greek there to try to open it up. So
that reminds me of another reason why I do this, and that's because when I do it, so there's the sense of looking at another language or another translation, if you don't know another language, to get into this unlearning process, to have a fresh look at it in a fresh way. There's also the idea that none of the translations are the original. So if you don't read Greek, then you can sort of triangulate, knowing that none of the translations are it, right? That somehow maybe you can triangulate.
yeah, it gives you maybe a broader spectrum of possibilities. I would agree with that. And of course, then we all come down to, where did this text actually come from? Are these, have they been recopied? Have they been, I mean, there's all kinds of ways we have to try and deal with the provenance of the text itself. And for Sufis, that's not really very important in itself. It's important only in that it helps me to perceive the wisdom that is in the text by Paul, in other words, that's attributed to Paul here, that we are willing to accept from it the learning that is there and the wisdom that is there to guide us.
It occurs to me that it also gave us permission to consider the possibility that the S in Spirit shouldn't be capitalized, that we could look at this and be curious about what Paul's saying in that way, knowing that the capitalization doesn't have to be in the original Greek, or that, whether it's the translators, whether it's a transcriber, whether it's the manuscripts are written in all capitals with no spaces or punctuation, right?
Oh, I agree completely. In fact, the whole idea of capitalizing the S in Spirit, in my mind, there may be a correction to this, but as I look at it historically, the whole minuscule and uppercase and lowercase letter system that we write with really was a 9th century invention by the scholars that worked in the court of Charlemagne. And so when we say, "Oh, look, that S is capitalized," I'm going, "Well, yeah, according to a set of concepts that we began to use, 800 years after Jesus or so." And we tend to put a lot of meaning into our own custom, rather than working with the text itself and try to make sure it makes its own internal sense and can speak to me with wisdom.
So what do we get if we look at it as a lowercase s? Where does this take us?
Well, for Sufi, it means my spirit and your spirit.
Right.
But what we would say by spirit, we mean soul. We would say that it deals with the soul. And I think today we're going to have a chance to talk a little bit more about the Sufi conceptualization of the soul.
Isn't that because in the Latter-day Saint tradition, we think of, let's see, isn't it the soul is the body plus the spirit? Whereas the spirit in other Christian traditions is equivalent to, what we call the spirit is called the soul. And so when we read spirit in the text, we shouldn't think of it in the Latter-day Saint way. We should think of it as the soul, meaning, what do I mean? It's that part of myself that's eternal.
Okay, yeah, but then again, in LDS theology, I've heard it spoken that We became the spirit children. Whatever I was, that I call my being gained a spirit, according to that sort of theology that I'm a spirit child of my Father in heaven. And so what was I before? Because I became a spiritual child. And so it merely begs the question of what is my original being.
This reminds me of some of the difficulties I've had translating Sufi texts, translating Al-Ghazali in particular, a Sufi who died in 1111, because he uses the word nafs, which is the Arabic for, well, that's the question, right? What is it? It's equivalent to the Hebrew nephesh, and it's usually, well, it's translated as soul. It translates self, as in yourself. So if I say yourself, or if the text appears to say yourself, it could actually mean your soul, which is really different. It could also refer to the ego self, right? So it's not always clear whether nafs means the soul, the higher self, or the ego self.
Well, that's a challenge for you as a translator, I'm sure. And I've run into it in the English translations and in the Arabic of some of the great Sufi writers. And you see that there's a struggle. Is it myself or is it my soul? And so I suppose there's two things I would say about that maybe these will help you. The first one is we're treating the soul like it's only one thing. And for the Sufi, the soul is one thing, but it's expressed in a variety of ways, and the soul exists, or so to speak, it acts. It's contextualized in its action by levels or different stations of the soul, and so we can purify it. So which one we're talking about becomes rather complex.
Could those states of the soul, or different levels at which the soul exists, could they be compared to attributes of God? So the soul has different attributes as God has different attributes. The names of God that we speak of both in the Sufi tradition and in the Christian tradition.
Yes, that's a good observation, because indeed we would say that the whole point of the soul's journey toward the divine is one of purification, in which we realize that all of the characteristics of the divine have always been with us the entire time. In other words, my soul possesses, in its purest sense, all of the characteristics of the divine, which are often expressed by names: the generous one, the loving one. These are all ways in which we try to give a name to the unnameable, but they are the characteristics of the divine. In fact, Joseph Smith said that if one would know God, one must know the character of God. And the Sufi would say the only way to do that is to know your own soul, because it already has the character of God in it.
So that would compare, the names you gave from the Sufi tradition would compare to Wonderful Counselor, Prince of Peace, etc., right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we would see those that way.
Coming back to this idea of getting to know God by knowing yourself, that is a core Sufi concept, isn't it? And that's because in my own self, or in my own soul, and see right there, I could say either one, couldn't I? In my own self or in my own soul, so myself generally and my soul in particular, I think I can find the image of God, the imago Dei. And so I can, if I, as the Sufi, as Al-Ghazali puts it, if I polish the mirror of the soul, it can accurately reflect the image of God in me.
And you begin to see it. Yeah, we find this in many spiritual writings. Dante has the same thing at the end of the Paradiso. In the very last verses of Lost Canto, he says that as he was gazing upon what he could comprehend of the divine, he said within it was drawn our image. In other words, I could see my image in it, and I could see its image in me. And so for the Sufi, being created in the image of God could be physical, right? And having a body and hands and all of the rest of it. But far more importantly is that the essence is in the same image, the soul and the divine.
That adds to my experience that I mentioned from last night, where I said I looked in the mirror and I saw my soul saw that image in the mirror wasn't it, right? It wasn't me. It wasn't my true self, my soul, right? And so it's interesting then that if all I saw in the mirror was this ego self, that I actually didn't see anything. I perceived. See, that's the thing, right? I didn't see with my eyes myself, but I perceived myself as not being that image that my eyes saw.
And we run into language again because I perceived myself.
Yes.
And it's the continual, what is the subject and what is the object of that?
That reminds me of Dante again. I found myself. I came to myself. I found myself. Mi ritrovai in una selva oscura, in a dark wood, right? The right way having been lost.
Well, and that's how the poem starts. 14,200 some odd lines of poetry, some of the finest poetry ever written in the Western world, begins with him being lost that way, saying, I came to myself. And so you go, well, who is the I that has brought the self to it? And what is the self that's being brought to the I? And Paul echoes this. This is all over the place in religious literature.
I'm seeing it now. This is what you're getting at, right? It's who is the I that knows the self? And what is the self that's separate from the I? So there's the ego and there's the soul, the higher self.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And from a mystical and a Sufi point, Dante, when he has this I came to myself experience, he finds himself in the dark wood. And the whole journey begins, but, it's not, nothing is really all that familiar to him in the terrain and in the geography of this place he finds himself in. He is all the familiarity has been stripped from him, and it's now going to become highly symbolic. And for Sufis, that's moving from the plane of the literal, which is the first level of reality, which is those things we can touch and feel. He's moving now to the imaginal, where he his spiritual imagination, not just his mental imagination, is the primary organ of apprehending what surrounds him.
I want to highlight that you said he sees not the physical but the imaginal realm, right? Not the material but the imaginal realm. And it's through his imagination that he perceives the imaginal realm, so that we're distinguishing between imaginal and imagination. And so the imaginal isn't the imaginary, and yet it's perceived through the imagination in some sense.
Yes, what I call the spiritual imagination, which is mystics often would refer to something like this. We all have different language and different traditions, but it breaks down into that we have the ability to perceive another reality, which is higher than the one we're in. Some would call it metaphysical. Some would call it, there's many ways we can try and talk about this, but the whole point is it has to be revealed to us or disclosed to us. And for the Sufi, the organ of disclosure is the soul. The soul discloses it to the ego.
So there's the answer to that question we brought up, right? Who's disclosing what to whom, right? Who is the discloser, and who is it that's experiencing that disclosure, right?
Right. Who's subject, who's object. And it's very difficult when each one of them are I or my. We run into this paradox, and if you begin to look around, you're going to find it everywhere. In 1 Nephi chapter 8, when Lehi has his dream, the first thing he says, I beheld myself. It's right there in the text. I beheld myself. And you come right into that quandary again. It's all over the place, but we don't. A Sufi would stop there and say, okay, what's going on? A mystic would, but the rest of us would go, well, he's dreaming about himself. But for us, it's far different, far more profound.
Yeah, it occurs to me that even though Italian doesn't work like Arabic or Hebrew, we've still explained in some sense through what we've said about the Arabic and the Hebrew how this idea of I found myself in Dante works, right? I found myself. We could say, I, the ego, found myself, the soul.
That's right. Or we could say even better, for me, it was more like my soul slapped my ego around and took me into its realm. Said, I don't want you to deal with this in Florence, Italy anymore, Dante, or Rome, or Ravenna, or whatever. I want you to deal with it in my realm. The only way you're going to get this is if you leave the familiar. In other words, what did he have to do to begin his journey? He had to unlearn.
Right. He had to get lost in the dark wood.
That's it.
Where he doesn't know what's going on, where everything is unfamiliar.
Yeah. One of the most well-read and smartest people of his day, well, he was stripped of the ability to use that knowledge except as the soul disclosed it to him through, and the divine disclosed it to him. Then he could bring his intellect to bear, but his intellect, his intellect for me gets split apart from him in this metaphor by Virgil becoming sort of his externalized intellect, and Dante becoming this soul who's trying to figure all this stuff out as he's working through this lost land.
You're reminding me with that, what you just said, one of the first Sufis I ever met was a very well-read man. And he saw me working hard at becoming a well-read man myself and said, Christopher, it's not in books. And I thought, well, that's easy for you to say. You've read all the books. I have to read all the books. I'm one of these men who has to touch the hot stove myself to find out. And I've been through a lot of books, Sheikh, and I've come to the realization that it's not in books. And that's why I sought you out. They do help. No, they really do. I'm glad you said that. I wanted to say that too. It's not that they have no value. Look at Dante. We're talking about the Divine Comedy. It has revealed a lot to us in our own personal reading, yours and mine, and right here in this conversation, even for those listening who haven't read it.
I hope that it inspires people to pick it up, because I taught Dante in medieval history courses or in world civilization when I was talking about the Middle Ages and Western civilization to help get them into some of the literature of the time. And I even taught a seminar once on Dante, the entire Divine Comedy. Well, I taught it more than once, but taught a seminar for a while on that and loved every part of it. But part of what was happening there is they had to realize that if they took their ego world into the reading of Dante, then Dante's just this kind of really crude guy that talks about torturing people in the underworld. They miss the entire spiritual import of Dante. But if they go to it to say, okay, I'm going to see how he's trying to figure out his spiritual and religious universe, then it awakens them in themselves. And they go, that's kind of how I'm struggling with something. Or I used to play the game and say, pick a circle of hell, purgatory, and paradise where you belong, and how self-revealing that could be to them.
Self-revealing, revealing the soul to the ego, right? I'm glad you said something about the second and third canticles, right? The Purgatorio and Paradiso, because when you talked about hell, I thought, well, there's more to Dante than hell, right? And I think so many people who have read any Dante have only read hell, and if their experience matches mine, they probably ended up depressed. And I've learned when I do read through Inferno when I finish, to read at least a line or more of Purgatorio to bring myself out of that, to be aware of it and to start to come out of it.
So if I were to bring that back, and I want to come to Paul here in a second and re-examine this, talk a little bit about this soul that seems to have, or our self that seems to have two parts. But let's come back to Paul here for just a second. Paul indicates that there are these two oppositions, and I take them as being oppositions within us. When Lehi in 2 Nephi 2 talks about there's opposition in all things, from my mind, it's not that there's opposition in this rock. It's not opposing anything. It has no will. It has no, but the opposition is within me. I could take that rock and build a structure that would protect people with it, or I can take that rock and bash somebody's head in with it. The
And the rock
opposition
doesn't
is
care.
within me. Yeah, the rock, it can't care. The rock is, and so I think when he says there's opposition in all things, I'm not so sure that it's saying what we think it says, that there's always opposition in everything we encounter. Instead, I think that the Sufi would say there's opposition within me, and that's exactly what Paul is saying, right? The flesh, the desires of the flesh are opposed to the desires of the Spirit, and I would assume vice versa. Oh, no, it says, for these are opposed to each other. Sorry, verse 17, he says, for these, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want.
And that's the part that I don't get at this point. If I understand the spirit with a lowercase s, and I see that I have a spirit and I have flesh, and that the desires of each are in opposition to each other, then it says to prevent you from doing what you want, I'm lost.
Yes. Okay, this is, again, where we come into the logical problem of this. This is actually probably something that we can devote an entire episode conversation to in the future. But for now, this you doing from what you want, again, reinforces the two within us. We are the one that the opposition is contained within. And from you doing what you want, then the question becomes, what is it that you truly want? And from a mystical and Sufi perspective, everything that is, we would call the flesh, decays. It changes. We either get old or we die, youth fades, or, we could talk about 100 different ways in which this works, that we are disappointed by the flesh. No matter how, we can invest more into it, but it seems that less and less and less comes out of it as we do that. And so what it's saying is there's a you that really does want something lasting, something enduring. And that's the thing we want. If I were to put it in Sufi terms, it would be our nature, which the Arabic word is fitra, which is when our soul comes into this realm now of corporeal bodies, what we might call mortality, I suppose, when it comes into this phase of our existence, that it comes with it's not neutral, it's not an empty slate, it's not tabula rasa, it comes with a purpose and a reason.
My understanding of Fitra, Master, of this primordial nature, is that it is, I know in the Islamic tradition, it's considered to be a Muslim, that one is born Muslim, and that if one becomes a Christian, it's because one's parents, in some sense, have led one astray. But I understand it as this idea that we are born with a desire for the divine, that we come from the divine and we seek to return to the divine.
That is exactly what the mystical and Sufi interpretation of this. We don't see it as any particular religion at all. In fact, it's kind of funny because when the Quran mentions Muslim, it doesn't seem to be talking about the people today we would call Muslims, meaning that they belong to the religion of Islam. It seems to be the people that are seeking the truth of the divine and surrender themselves to that path. And so it says Abraham was a Muslim. Well, Abraham predated Muhammad by nearly 2,000 years. So what could that possibly mean? Well, Muslim can't mean belonging to the religion founded by Muhammad.
Right. Muslim just means one who submits to God. Islam meaning submission to God. And Abraham is considered as though he were a Muslim before Muhammad. And others could be as well if we understand Islam as submission to God. And he's compared in that sense and called a Hanif, some kind of proto-monotheist, which I think isn't that different from the conception of Abraham in our tradition, right, as a proto-monotheist.
Yeah, he was definitely that way, I believe. So now to kind of pull fitra or nature back to this, I would say in LDS tradition, we would probably call it the light of Christ. which is that we're given a direction finder. So we don't come as tabula rasa, as Locke would put it, at a blank slate that anything can be written on me because I come with nothing. That's not true. I come with something, and what that something is a predisposition to seek the divine, and that's within the human. It's a gift by the divine to the human soul, and so when it says prevent you from doing what you want, we would interpret that as it prevents your ego from doing what your soul wants, which is your fitra, which is your predisposition to the divine or the light of Christ.
Yeah, it's interesting that we do the same thing in our tradition that the Muslims do in their tradition. If we say you have fitra and that's supposed to equal the religion of Islam, in Islam, then over in Christianity we say you have the light of Christ. So it's this specific, Christian concept. But then again, I think of Christ as something bigger than Jesus. I think Jesus is the Christ, and yet there's a Christ consciousness that's in us all, and that's what we call the light of Christ. And so there's this sense that Christ is bigger than Jesus.
I think that's beautiful, and I believe that it addresses several problematic theological problems and resolves them in my mind. One of them would be why would we? The only reason we might think that an infant is in danger is because we see us as fallen and corrupted beings, right? That our nature is not a good one. And therefore, we need to have a rescuing earlier on, and so that notion of we've got to deal with a newborn child almost as something corrupted, to me it disappears, because you go, well, none of us come that way. Adolf Hitler didn't come that way from a Sufi perspective, right? It's and so we all know what we should be doing, but we often fail to follow through with it.
It occurs to me that we speak of Christ as though Christ were Jesus's last name, and that somehow limits this Christ consciousness, which we could say again is equivalent to the Spirit of Christ, which is in all of us, so that Christ is in fact bigger than Jesus, and yet Jesus is the Christ.
Right. And we often, by the way, speaking of kind of the two natures of who we are within the LDS experience, we often speak of the mortal Jesus and the immortal Jesus. And so it shouldn't come as a surprise that we're already caught up in this this notion of divided selves. I think it's implicit or explicit in what we already have in our theology.
Are we suggesting that Jesus himself has this divided nature at any point?
Well, if he was going to be mortal like us, then I don't see how he could not have it, because if he didn't have it, then he would not understand us still. Yep. What I read in Alma 7, or what I read in Hebrews 4 and 5, that Jesus understands us because he suffered as we suffered, or he was tempted as we are tempted. In other words, that his compassion flows out of an identical kind of experience. That suggests to me that he had to, right? That otherwise you're cheating, right? Otherwise you're saying, well, he was exactly like you except totally different.
Does this show up in the temptation of Christ? Does it show up in, Christ's prayer in the garden? Either one of those or both?
I believe, as I was growing up, the impression I got from, my classes in Sunday school and things like that was that that the temptations were something pro forma that Jesus needed to go through. Now,
Master, I know you're a lawyer, and I'm actually an expert legal translator. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't.
What does pro forma mean? for our audience?
It means like by the checklist, something that's required. It's something you do because it's on the list and you have to do it. And so you're following the forms, right? I
Going
may
through the
already know your
motions?
name. It could be, well,
For Jesus,
we
I
would
mean.
say, oh yeah, like he had to be baptized because everybody has to be baptized. He didn't need to be baptized for any other reason. I'm going, well, we don't know that. And if he's going to be like us, then probably he had to. And it says that he grew from grace to grace. We understand from many scriptures that Jesus as a person is going through the things we're going through. And otherwise, I don't know that he really does understand us, because apparently compassion has to be born out of experience, not out of book learning. So yeah, pro forma means you just do it because it's something you have to do.
So he's tempted, becomes like he's baptized. It's not really a baptism in the sense that he doesn't need it. So he's not really tempted when the text of the Bible tells us he's tempted. And yet you're suggesting perhaps he is tempted.
Well, yeah. Jesus himself, toward the end of his life, says to his disciples, ye are they who remained with me through my temptations. And you're going, well, they weren't there when, the devil tempted him to turn rocks. That was before they were called. Rocks into bread and the pinnacle of the temple and those things. So it couldn't be those temptations. And this is before the Garden of Gethsemane, so it couldn't be anything that might have occurred then. Instead, we either take him seriously or we don't, right? If he says, I had these temptations when you were with me, then he had temptations when he was with them. And I want to talk about that a little bit later as we get into the soul a little deeper. So just to recapitulate where I think we are so far with our discussion, I would reread the NRSV, Galatians 5, verses 16 through 18. Live by the soul, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the soul, and what the soul desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to prevent your soul from doing what it wants. But if you are led by the soul, you're not subject to the law. And we can deal with that not subject to the law a little bit. Well, I just mentioned pro forma. Why not deal with it right now? In other words, if we do things because the law requires us to do it, then I think we've missed out on something important in terms of our doing things willingly. Where it says the willing and the obedient, in the Doctrine and Covenants, the willing and the obedient will eat of the fruit of the land of Zion in the latter day. The willing and the law has something beyond it, which is willingness, which is voluntary. And so Paul's trying to say, the law can't save you. The law will only point out the ways in which you've messed up, but it can't save you. What saves you is the voluntary surrender that we talked about already, of one's soul to the divine, out of love, out of wanting to be more like the divine, not out of being required to do certain things on the Sabbath or on Monday nights or whatever it is. It's not to say those things are wrong. They are not wrong. The law is good. But it's not an end. So I think what he's saying, if you're led by the soul, you're not subject, meaning under. You're not controlled by the law. You now can be like Jesus, who often disobeyed the law of his day.
I remember looking at the Greek of this text, this particular text, and the subject word is translating hupo, which means literally under, as in one is a servant or subservient to the law.
Okay. Yeah, one has to obey the law, we would say in that case, right? Right, the law defines damnation. It says if you don't obey me, then you're damned, and that's being under the law. How about if we can be not above the law in the typical way of saying it, but that we can, well, Jesus said it better than I can ever say it, that he came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. And the fulfilling of the law then is spelled out in the rest of Matthew chapter 5, right, which goes beyond that. So I think this is, again, another subject we're going to probably deal with in greater depth, but it's not that you're under the law, it's that you're empowering the law. You're moving the law into every space of your life, because the law is general, but your life is unique to you. How do you then live according to your soul, but only follow general rules? Well, you should follow those general rules. I think Paul is telling us, is not that you ignore them, but that you now go beyond them. So instead of under, I would say beyond the law, according to your soul's own righteousness and integrity.
Or put another way, instead of saying you're above the law, you're beyond the law.
Yeah.
There's something higher than the law that calls to you. There's something higher than the law that you're obeying.
That's right. But and you don't leave the law behind so much as you take it. It's with you, and it grounds you. And so Sufis are often misunderstood by, I know a word you use all the time that speaks to this issue.
What is that?
Antinomian, right?
Right.
That we're accused of being antinomian.
Which is literally anti-law.
And we're not. Moving beyond the law means that we bring the law with us. But what the law is, for universal Sufi, is whatever the person brings with them. Meaning, in the universal Sufi order, you'll have Christians and Jews and Buddhists and people of Native American religion or whatever. I mean, we don't divide between we don't divide ourselves or set ourselves apart from all of that. But instead, we'd say, well, that discipline that you gain from the law is important because it helps you then move on to living by the soul, right? So we're not antinomian. We believe we need a discipline. We need structure, and we need guidance, especially as we're growing up. But if we're going to fulfill it, then that's why I said Jesus many times just disregarded the law or broke the law or said, "So what to the law?" You know, it's not what comes out of a man's mouth. It's what excuse me. Yeah, it's the idea that the commandment did not pick grain on the Sabbath. He just said that's not the big deal. Or how his disciples washed their hands. They didn't wash it according to the law. And he said, no, look, that's not the issue. You're missing the real issues here.
That seems on the face of it antinomian. And yet what you're saying is Jesus is not above the law rather than under it, but beyond it rather than under it. And it reminds me of the concept in Islamic law. The listener may be familiar with Sharia as this concept of Islamic law. And yet there's this idea, this science, this area of study in Islamic law, which is maqasid al-Sharia, which is the study of the purposes and intents of the law, such that the law may not apply because it somehow subverts the actual intent and purpose of the law. That's what Jesus is doing.
Yeah, the application would subvert the purpose.
This is in English terms, jurisprudence, right? Or philosophy of law.
Or philosophy of law. Yes, exactly. Or when I was a practicing attorney, I made several arguments grounded in policy, and often was able to prevail against very large and important clients simply by looking at the legislative history of a law and saying, Your Honor, if the court applies the law the way that my opponent wants the law applied, it will directly subvert the stated intent and purpose of the law. And it worked. And so that is a very real and a very true thing. Well, let's, if we can, maybe shift a little bit now to a discussion of what is the soul in Sufi conceptualization and what do we mean by levels of the soul? And I don't want to go into all of them. We're going to deal with the first of the 7 levels that we talk about in my order, which is it's called sometimes the lower self, There's several names for it, but let's talk about the soul itself. Just very briefly, the idea of what our original being is becomes difficult to describe because it's an essence. And essences, if you can give a name to it, that's not the essence, right? Because they are beyond names. They are being an existence that if you define it, then that's not it. And so, like the divine, which is an essence, our soul is an essence. So that's where we begin.
We talked about this in a previous episode, right? The distinction between essence and manifestation. Manifestations are named. Essence isn't named.
Yes, that's correct. So if I say God is whatever, big, small, large, tall, even if I say God's eternal, that's my concept of whatever I think eternity is, which I frankly have no understanding of. So I'm saying something, but I don't even know what I'm talking about.
That reminds me of a beautiful concept in Sufism, in Sufi interpretation or exegesis of scripture, right? The idea that the whole reason, this is speaking to mercy and justice, God's mercy and justice, and the whole reason that there is justice is so that, or that justice is manifest, I should say, is so that mercy can be manifest, because all of God's attributes have to be manifest.
Absolutely.
Or manifested.
And the Sufis say, actually they are, but we can't see the scope of the work, right? It's an ever-unfolding process across all of existence. And that we gain a confidence, a certainty that that's what's unfolding there. So let me then take us to how Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was the person who brought Sufism to the West in about 1910, how Hazrat Inayat Khan came from India, how he framed the idea of essence. He called it intelligence. And I don't think that he means by that the intellect. I think what he's calling intelligence is just a closest approximation. Of course, this reminds Latter-day Saint listeners of Doctrine and Covenants, section 93, the concept of intelligence there, which is neither created nor can it be. If we read that verse out of the Doctrine and Covenants, intelligence, therefore, has always existed. And it seems to be what was there before what we would call spirit was there, spirit children, this concept, and bodies and all the rest of it. So we'll begin with intelligence.
And that reminds me of, going back to verse 17, where I was trying to understand the you, right? The you that is prevented from doing what you want. And so I was looking at the Greek, and it's your being, right? It's your being. So that would be the very essence of who and what you are. And so we're back to that same concept of your soul, right?
Yes. You prevent your being from doing what your being wants. Back to verse 17 in the Paul, right? And so the being, the idea is the you is the ego or the flesh. We would probably accept that definition. I would as a Sufi. And so the ego prevents your being from doing what your being wants.
Can I then try reading through all of it again? Verses 16 through 18. Okay, so live by, we said this is your own spirit, right? So live by your soul, I say, and do not gratify the desires of your flesh. For what your flesh desires is opposed to your soul, and what your soul desires is opposed to your flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent your soul from doing what your soul wants. But if you're led by your spirit or by your soul, you are not subject to the law, meaning you are not under the law, but rather which doesn't mean you're above it. You're not above the law. That's a term of art, right? We say above the law, but rather beyond it. In that place where Jesus is saying the things he's saying about picking corn or what you did in court, or maqasid al-sharia, the jurisprudence or philosophy of law that gets at the purposes and intents of the law, such that we apply, I know how to put it in LDS terms, the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law.
Yeah, back to Paul. The letter kills. The Spirit gives life.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that Paul is continually I think he's trying to communicate this to us all the time, but he keeps admitting in many of these epistles just that we're not ready for it. He said, I would like to talk to you about the things of the Spirit, but you're not ready. That's back to 1 Corinthians 3. So guess what? You're babes in Christ, and I'm not saying I'm not a babe in Christ, but I do want to eat better food. And he's saying you're babes in Christ, so you get milk. And milk can be good for you, but after a little while, you can't live on milk alone. When you grow up, you've got to have other sustenance. At least you've got to have strained peas and carrots, so you got to at least get to the Gerber level of feeding that way. So I think he's constantly trying to say, I want to talk about what your soul is about, but I'm having trouble because we're still stuck in all of these fleshly desires and pettiness that we have and all the problems we have with ourselves. And so guess what I get to talk about? So every once in a while, I think in his writing, what he really wants to do is poking through. It's like peeking out once in a while. And so we get these sort of brief intimations, and I think that these verses are one of those where he wants to take just a moment and inspire us to live by the soul. Live by the soul. Do not gratify the desires of the flesh. I think it's an exhortation for us to move toward fulfilling the law by trying to find what is beyond the law, the purpose of the law, spirit of law. So let's go now to this idea of intelligence. Well, essentially what the soul is, as I understand Hazrat Inayat Khan, and as I feel it within myself, the soul is an awakened intelligence. In other words, I've always had being as intelligence, but not consciously. But my consciousness was contained within my own core being, this intelligence. And so what the divine does to move us along this path is twofold. It wakes us up, so to speak. It brings us into consciousness that we exist. It's like a little baby in utero. We wouldn't say that it knows that it exists, but it most certainly does exist. But birth and then education and training and life can be a constant path of awakening to the fact that we exist. And Sufis would see this in the same terms. That's why the term Rahim in Arabic is used with this a lot, because Rahim means the womb.
And Rahm is where we get Rahman and Rahim, right? The merciful, the compassionate, referring to God. So does this mean that my intelligence is in some sense my infant soul?
In a metaphorical sense, yeah.
Okay.
In a metaphor. In other words, it's. I don't think I'd say literally or in some way, but as the metaphor, yeah, because, well, that's what our entire existence is. As a Sufi, sometimes people say, well, what is the Sufi path really trying to say? And I said, well, it really says God is waiting for us to grow up. Right? That's really what it's about. And so that's one of the problems with the law. If we end at the law, it's like we've hit, age whatever, 15 or something, and we go no further. We find ourselves struggling to maintain that level of living the law. And I'm not going to say we go no further, but it's the danger is we will think we've gone all the way. So, I have a good friend who just says, hey, I live all the rules. I'm set. And I'm going, really? I know they're a good person, but they think, hey, I'm living the rules, so I'm good to go.
That's all I've got to do. Well, Paul addresses this directly in his letters, right? That's not the way it works according to Paul.
That's right.
And so it seems then that we can say in some sense that Sufism is a path to spiritual maturity.
Yes. Yes. That's what it wants. It wants us to maturate. It wants us the soul to become fully realized, fully actualized. And
to rise up in levels, as we mentioned, there are levels.
Exactly correct.
Or through the levels of the soul, right. to a higher station.
Yeah, the levels are there. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, the levels are there to help us learn where we may be, right? They're ways of measuring kind of or gauging how we're doing. They're not, we wouldn't say that they're levels in some sort of external reality, but they are self-analysis metaphors. And we'll
You know,
talk about that as we go into, yeah.
with that, I think of Dante again, as he goes
Absolutely.
through the levels of hell and the terraces of purgatory, and flies through the heavens, right? There are
Yes.
levels, right? And so that means this is a spiritual cosmography, not a physical one, right? And so it's
That's
showing
right.
us, as you said, they're checkpoints, if you will,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Stations. I think
Absolutely.
they're called stations in Sufism, right? Maqamat. They're
Yes. Yeah.
stations.
Yep. Yep. Makamat. That's right. And they stations, and we use the metaphor of a pilgrimage or a caravan, right? So that we're on this journey, and where we're staying is sort of that where my soul is abiding is a station.
Master, in addition to teaching history and practicing law, you also taught singing, right?
Yes, I did at BYU
And
Idaho for many years.
isn't I think my first exposure to the word maqam, that we said is a station, and maqamat or stations, was in some musical context. Is that
Yes.
helpful here? Could
Yeah.
you explain that?
Yeah. I haven't actively studied Middle Eastern music. My understanding of it is we would call it keys or
Okay.
scales, although it doesn't
Scales, there you
directly
go.
correspond.
Scales, you
Yeah.
scale, right?
Yeah.
Which means in some sense you're climbing,
That's
right?
right. Yep. Yep. In fact, degradation could be literally to go down the ladder rather than
That's
going
right.
up.
I'm reminded of a concept that shows up in Western tradition, and I think it's, I've taught Islamic philosophy for 7 years. I should say I taught Islamic philosophy for 7 years, and I had to make this distinction all the time. I was going to say that in our tradition, in Western tradition, there's this concept that actually comes from the Islamic tradition, but the Islamic tradition is part of the Western tradition, and Western philosophy owes a debt to Islamic philosophy. So it's kind of a false dichotomy. But the idea is we see in the Renaissance, in Pico de la Mirandola, this hierarchy of beings, right? And well, not
Yes.
the hierarchy of beings, that's not new. But what's new in him is the idea that you can that humans can either rise in the hierarchy of being to the level of angels, or they can fall to the level of beasts. And my understanding is that this concept comes to Pico through his Hebrew teacher, who probably got it from Al-Ghazali, whom we mentioned earlier, the Sufi who died in 1111.
Oh, I think that all of those things are possible, and in fact, but that's also how I see the Jacob's ladder dream. Angels are us, and we're ascending, we're descending. Uh, Within Sufism, we say that humans have one of our natures, if you will, is the angelic nature, and so we can move up grades, grados, or we can move down grades, degrados, or degrade, degradation, and that's that we move along these stations.
Oh, I see what you did there. So degrade, right, means to go down grades.
Let's take a moment, and I'm going to read through sort of a brief description of the first station of the soul. And by first, it's referring to where we begin, not first in it's number one in some kind of ranking or priority. Instead, it's the first stop on our pilgrimage, returning to the divine. And I'll just read through this for a minute. Now,
Would it be the bottom rung of the ladder then?
yes, it would be the bottom rung of the ladder. In
Okay.
fact, we may even say we're not on the ladder yet.
Okay.
Yeah, we may turn around and say, well, this is where you step up onto the ladder off the dirt
This
or
is
off the
what we
grass or
mean by
something.
base, don't we?
Yes. Yeah, the law puts you, yeah,
This is a baseness that we're talking about.
I agree with you, and I think that's what the law does. It gets you to the ladder and gives you firm footing, and says, now let's see if you really want to climb this thing or not. So yeah, that's a great metaphor for kind of how we would look at the law. It gives you the ability to walk and to move and to find ladders and decide how you're going to climb. And if we're not obeying the law, then we never find a place to ascend. We're just wandering in a dark wood.
So the law is that pedagogos, right? That teacher, or that, right? That schoolmaster, I think we call it, that guides us not necessarily all the way, as you've been suggesting, right? To back to the divine, but rather to the ladder.
Yes.
Where we begin our ascent to the divine. Isn't this the idea too, these stations that we're talking about, isn't this the idea behind the night journey of Muhammad? Because he does also ascend, right? And Paul himself, Paul is a mystic in his tradition. And I don't mean Kabbalah, that comes later, but there is a Jewish mysticism at the time of Paul, and we know about his background and education, and he's a mystic, and he's using the text of, what is it, Ezekiel, that strange text at the beginning of Ezekiel that deals with the four beasts, right? And there are these...
Yeah, the four beasts, the wheel within the wheel, chariot beasts, yeah.
Right, and so this is... some kind of ascension texture. It's used that way in Jewish mysticism at Paul's time. And I remember N.T. Wright in his biography of Paul suggesting that perhaps on his donkey, not a horse as in Caravaggio, right, but on his donkey as he rides to Damascus, Paul is practicing this form of mysticism, and that's when he has his opening, his vision. He ascends.
He does ascend.
To Christ,
and he calls it, I was taken up. In fact, it's not him ascending, he's taken up, right? You get to the ladder, and sometimes you can't climb the ladder. Well, once you really struggle and you work on that, then sometimes you're taken up a rung, because we can't, it's something we really can't do on our own entirely, but we have to put ourselves on that ladder and struggle with that ladder and keep working with it. And that's the Sufi path, which is the divine. Those who love you, including your master, your sheikh, we would say also all the messengers that have been given, and in my order we don't distinguish between them. We would be just as willing to accept, Lot. Lot is a prophet within our tradition, and that's because there's more writing on Lot than just that he messed up. There's a lot that. Pardon the pun, that would be in there. And so we accept messengers from everywhere. So messengers, guides, and finally the divine is the ultimate lifting force, the motive force that moves us along. And in Dante, toward the end, as you say, he flies, so to speak, from star to star. But through much of that, it's Beatrice who takes him up.
He's been taken up too, right?
That's right. He was taken. That is correct. So let's.
So we can't do it on our own, is what that implies to me.
That's right. Because
I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. That's one way. That is the way, isn't it? The way, the truth, the life, right? The way, as a matter of fact, the earliest, before we get Christianity, as such, called as such, it's called the way. And it's interesting to me to note that the Tao, as in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao means the way. Sharia, which we know as Islamic law, means the way. And halakha, which is all those rules that Jews follow, right? 600 plus rules, also means the way. So these are ways to God. It occurs to me that one of my favorite Sufis, the Sufi poet, Rumi, best-selling poet in America today, which is really strange that this 13th century Muslim mystic is the best-selling poet in America today. That's in no small part thanks to Coleman Barks, who's providing renderings of Rumi.
Who is a Sufi too, by the way.
Coleman Barks?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. That explains why he's so into Rumi. Although many who are not Sufis really find Rumi's work attractive. Again, best-selling poet in America today. Yeah. But Rumi tells us that there are as many paths to earth as there are people on earth. So there are not only these ways I've mentioned, But within each of those ways, there's my way, your way, their way.
Yeah. Well, your ladder is composed of those things in your life that you need to rise above. And I
Mm.
can't climb your ladder because those are not my challenges. And you can't climb my ladder, so to speak, metaphorically, because those are my challenges. And so what the Sufi master is trying to do is let people climb their ladder and offer any help or advice or guidance that they can give. But the Sufi master doesn't climb the ladder. They're more or less a little bit more expert in ladders, right? Does that make sense? We sort of, we've dealt with the idea of these ladders a lot, and so we view our role as kind of saying, all right, well, you have to discover your ladder because I can't really tell what it is, but as you talk to me and work with me, I can say, oh, well, this part of the ladder commonly manifests itself that way.
And since you've already said that my ladder, the rungs of my ladder are made up of those things that I have to rise above, then another role of the Sufi master then would be to perhaps to mirror to me those things which are the things that I have to rise above, that are those rungs.
Yes, that's right.
Because otherwise I could just read a book, right? A book can tell me
Right.
all about ladders. There are Sufi books and they do tell about ladders, but they can't tell me about my ladder. That's where you come in.
Well, that's why we would say that the importance of the guide, the sheikh, the master, is exceptionally important as we begin to rise up this ladder because we don't even know really what the ladder is or how it might work or what a wisdom tradition is supposed to dispense through the generations of masters the deeper teaching, which has to be done on a one-to-one basis. It has to be done with Abdul Haq, with you, Christopher, and your ladder. It can't be done. We live in a self-help world, and the thing that this is all suggesting is that we need a guide because we can read everything we want about doing something, but doing it is entirely different.
I can testify that. I can testify to that because among the many books I've read have been many self-help books, and I've gotten a lot further, or even farther. I've gotten a lot farther, a lot faster with you than I have through any or all of them.
Well, God be praised. Then what we're working on is happening and occurring for you, and as you know, this is just voluntary. This is something that as a master you do because you have to learn to love the people you work with somehow. And it can be a heartbreaking process in some ways or a painful process, but should always be a process where we're striving for that at least. So
I know it has been with me, Master.
no, no.
Oh, yes, it has.
Well, sometimes masters will say the thing that nobody wants to hear.
Mm.
And I've had that happen, and I know others who have had that happen, which is if they love you enough, they're going to tell you what you need to hear. And that's an act of love, too, because they're going, they could walk away from you and just say, okay, hasta la vista, and good luck with that ladder. And, but sometimes we hear what we don't want to hear, which is, painful. So let's move on to the discussion of the lowest level of the soul. And I'm going to just give you this definition I often use with students. The Arabic name for this is al-nafs al-amara, which nafs, of course, we've already said, pertains to soul for the Sufi. And so this is the soul that is al-amara, which is subject to well, Arabic. Translate that for just a minute, if you would. An-nafs al-amara.
Well, it's either, is it a commanding soul or is it a soul that's
Mm-hmm.
commanded, or is it maybe both? Which is it? I understand it as the commanding soul, but then the question is, what is what is it commanding? Oh, well, if it's commanding the ego self, then it's not the bottom rung. So it seems more like it's a soul that's commanded by the ego.
Yes, it's the core problem that we have, which is a soul being clothed in flesh and set loose on this mortal world, subject to hunger, subject to pleasures, subject to hormones, subject to, there's all the things we're going through that were never known before in our soul's existence, never experienced before. It can be overwhelming.
Oh, so this is the soul. Oh, so this is the soul that is commanded by the desires of the flesh.
That's back to Paul. That's exactly right. And we would not say it's the soul. We would say it's when the soul not the soul yields, but when we when we don't live in the soul, we don't live by the Spirit, so to speak, as Paul would say. We live by the flesh, which means that there's a balance in there somewhere in which emphasis can be given one way or the other. That's right. And so, yeah, back to Paul. I think it's exactly what he's saying.
So the station of our soul, as we've been talking about the level at which it is acting, right? Or not acting, right? Because it's being acted upon by the ego, is this level where the flesh rules over the soul, which is upside down.
That's right. Yeah,
according
can't
to Paul.
Make spiritual progress that way. Yeah. Why would you climb the ladder and leave the earth when the earth has everything you want on it to satisfy the flesh?
Exactly, yeah.
And so, and then there are, quite frankly, to me, we often make up a heaven we want to live in that is fleshly. So we'll say, sometimes jokingly, but, I can't believe there's not going to be ice cream in heaven because ice cream is heavenly. And I know people don't really mean that deeply, but I'm going, why is it that we always want to convert what's at the top of the ladder into what we already have down here on the earth? Or worse yet, that there's so many virgins waiting for me up there.
Well, I think it shows that we're lacking in understanding. We see through a glass darkly, as Paul would put it. I have my own version of this that at least acknowledges that. I say, either there will be vanilla ice cream in heaven, or there won't, and it will be okay in some way that I can't possibly comprehend. Because vanilla ice cream is so important to me. Or at least it is to my flesh. So if it's not important to my soul, then when I get there, it won't matter.
Well, see, and wherever there is, I mean, we can have another Sufi discussion about where there is, what heaven is, but that's a very big, long one, and but that's, you're pointing out something, which is we tend to make heaven exactly like earth, only for eternity. And you can eat as much as you want because you're not going to get a heart attack or gain weight. And so we tend to be limited in our spiritual imagination. We don't really try to peer into that from our soul. We just, and I'm not, again, I don't want to make too big a deal out of that, but I think it is revealing that this is where we go, that heaven has to be like this thing that I understand in the flesh. Okay, so nafs al-amara, the commanding soul, literally, but there's certain other phrases that I use with it. The impulsive soul, the soul toward degradation, the divided soul. The one I usually use I call the divided soul. And that isn't the soul itself is divided, but that the soul is uncertain of its role, and that allows the ego to step in. We haven't gained certainty.
So is it or is it not then, to check my understanding, when you say the divided soul, I was thinking in terms of, again, back to Paul, right? The idea that my spirit and my flesh, or my soul and my flesh, are in some kind of struggle with each other.
Right. So what we would say is your soul wants to climb the ladder and your flesh wants to go back and get a double cheeseburger. and it's
and vanilla ice cream.
And vanilla, of course. I'm sorry, that was a given.
You forgot the vanilla ice cream.
Right. So these stations of soul don't say there's many souls, and the divided soul doesn't say there's two souls. It's simply saying that our intentionality. This is ghafla. We have heedlessness, and so we go up and say, "Hey, I'm going to climb a rung of the. I'm going to try to climb a new rung of the ladder today." Oh dang! First, I'm going to have some vanilla ice cream, and then we never manage to make it back to the ladder. We meet someone that we haven't seen for a while and decide to have lunch together, and and maybe it's a week before we get back to the ladder, or maybe never. But it's this distraction that takes us away from that. The flesh is the grand distractor for us. And I don't think anybody's saying that the flesh isn't important, but we're saying that that the soul should lead out and the flesh should follow along.
I have another joke, and I'm only half kidding. I was thinking, is it okay if we're recording this on a Saturday afternoon,
Yeah.
so is it okay if I have, vanilla ice cream tonight, Saturday night, and if I go to church tomorrow morning?
Well, you have to make that decision on your own, don't you? You want me to
Of
really
course.
answer that?
Well,
Are
I
we
have to
gonna
listen to
go,
my
well?
soul. I think, the reason
Okay, so what does your
I'm
soul tell
only
you?
half joking. Well, I think the reason I'm only half joking is because I'm trying to point to, we can't just think about our spiritual progress on Sunday. And I don't think, and I don't think that having a Sunday, which does have vanilla ice cream, is going to stop us from making spiritual progress. The question is, I think, again, of whether things are upside down, or whether whether the soul commands the ego or the ego commands the soul. Am I right?
Yep, that's right. That's the question. In other words, does your soul, do you kind of get around to the wants of the soul if you've eaten all the vanilla ice cream first? Or do you want to say, no, I'm going to do some soul work, and then, I would discipline myself as to when I have my ice cream or whatever. I mean, the metaphor begins to break down the further we
Of
push it
course.
along. But
It's been fun, though.
so this, oh no, I'm great with it. This is the first station on this Sufi pilgrimage of the soul. And it's one where the nafs al-amara, the divided soul, I'll probably refer to it as the impulsive soul and the divided soul in our discussion from now on, but where we're
Okay.
faced with a genuinely binary decision, which means, I put it this way, and decades ago this came to me, and it was in a way that was uh, painful, which is a lot of my most important choices are really, I'm only choosing between two things, and I called it, I'm choosing God or not God. And so the not God might be lying, or the not God might be stealing, or the not God might be being angry, or the not God might be, but the not God is ego. The God is the soul choice. And so, I don't like binaries. You know that about me. But I don't think there are very many. But in this one, I think there is a binary. This God or not God choice, in a very real way, or soul or not soul, is another way to put it. Am I going to take my guidance from my soul or not? Is a simple way of reducing complex choices to a more simplified format. I would call this the opening, if you will, of the path of self-surrender, the path of thy will, not mine, be done. And that can be a very painful path. And for persons who have really felt this in their life, they would know this. And I don't want to go even further into my oldest daughter's death at 22 months, which was a very grueling, lifelong, for her, process of fighting a serious liver disease. But for me, having to surrender my will in the sense that I wanted my daughter to live and be healthy, and I didn't want to lose her, and my soul was racked with the suffering of that desire, where I actually said, because I knew that the divine knew it was best for her to go, that I was too ignorant of what the consequences of what I was seeking would be, how terrible it could turn out for her. Life but painful life, or life but sick life. I didn't know. And so finally I had to say, thy will be done, with something tremendously precious on the altar of sacrifice. And I think that ultimately these are the moments, you talked about the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus saying, not my will, but thine be done. But he struggled with it. He said, the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. And 3 times he asked for the cup to be passed in Matthew 26. So I think it's very important to know that even Jesus struggled. The flesh did not want to go through it, but his spirit was willing, and he put himself on the altar of sacrifice for that purpose.
Allah yarham, Master, may God have mercy on her soul. And I know that just as her struggle was a lifelong struggle, yours continues to be as well.
You're right. I mean, reconciling myself to that decision has occupied much of my life, but it led to such powerful self-disclosure of the divine and self-disclosure of my soul that I would never trade it. Just like Dante in the beginning of his Divine Comedy says, but it was so bitter and hard what's going to happen to me. It was so terrible what you're going to read about happening to me. But because of the good that I gained therein, I'm going to share it with you. In other words, we look back on it, on the good, and love it for that. So this idea of thy will be done, right? Soul or not soul, God or not God, is at the heart, I think, of what Paul is trying to tell us when he talks about the desires of the flesh are opposed to the desires of the spirit. And he's describing, for me as a Sufi, this first level. So it's a realm that is mastered by discipline combined with the commitment to move forward. The discipline gets us to the ladder, and the commitment to move forward lifts our foot up to the first rung. And I think that this is why, as a Sufi, I'm not antinomian. I don't say, oh, I can just ignore all those nasty 10 commandments now because I'm free. That's not it at all. If I'm being honest with myself, then I need to make sure that whatever I choose to live by as the law of my soul, that I try to live by it to the best of my ability. This brings us to another Sufi term that I think is critical for us, which is, as you know, this idea of Lucifer becoming Satan, or in the Quran, Iblis becoming Shaitan, is central to our understanding of these opposing forces of spirit and flesh. And so Satan as a literal figure is often talked about. Capital S Satan, yes, is often talked about within these religions. But I'm going to say something rather bold here, which is for the mystic and for the Sufi, at least for me as a Sufi, and I believe for the Christian Sufis I know, Satan with a capital S is largely irrelevant.
Well, in the Hebrew Bible, we get the Satan, lowercase s, right? This is a role.
Right.
This is an accuser. Right. When I think of, if I'm looking around for an accuser, if there is a capital S Satan out there, I can't see him. But if I go look in the mirror, there's my accuser.
That's exactly right.
I'm really hard on myself.
That's right. And the judgment we render, yes.
Does that mean I'm hard on my soul? When I say I'm hard on myself, it occurs to me I'm hard on my soul. The ego wants to beat up the soul, and the soul doesn't want to beat up on anything, including the ego.
Right. Well, the ego we have to have an ego to function in society. We wouldn't get up out of bed in the morning and go to work.
It'd be scary.
If we'd be terrified. Yeah, and so it isn't that you don't have ego, but let's see if we can work through this shaitan in that internal sense. Yeah.
There is something really important, though, that I learned last night, an experience I had, and that is that while the ego is necessary, as you've pointed out, as a protection, so to speak, right? That we don't have to. We can realize we are safe, and then drop the ego, right? So maybe it's important to have it, just to to check and make sure we're safe. But once we find that we are, we can drop the ego and we can show up in a more genuine way. And I experienced that with friends last night, and it was such friends old and new. It was such a beautiful experience.
Well, anytime we can feel like we're free of the ego is a beautiful experience. For the Sufi, it's called fana'a, which means annihilation. Annihilation of the ego is the final, ultimate step on the Sufi path. It's entering into the, if you will, existing within the divine presence. And fana'a then is likened to burning, and we can go into this in another episode too, but it's that the ego is burned away. We've gone through the refiner's fire. We're like Dante at the top of Mount Purgatory. We've passed through the cleansing fire that terrifies us but relieves us. And so the ego helps us. We can teach the ego to help us in life if it's subject to the spirit.
That's spiritual alchemy. That's the purification of the soul in Sufi terms, right? So,
yes. Yeah, this idea of purification is likened unto fire, and fana'a is often given the image of fire.
So I'm reminded obliquely, there may be a connection here, there may not be. I'm reminded obliquely of the idea in Buddhism where it said, if you meet the Buddha, kill him. So when you said annihilation, that popped into my head. And so I'm relating this somehow to the God ideal we've talked about in a past episode, right? Because the idea of killing the Buddha is that's not actually the Buddha, right? It's something like if you find, we could say in a Christian sense, if you find God, kill him, because that's not God, right? That's your God ideal. And that's something. And so I guess the connection I'm trying to make, tell me if this works, is our God ideal is created by our ego. And so it's a projection of our ego, just like our projection of ice cream onto heaven.
Correct. And I would say it is the ego that is very much involved in that, but I would also say that the mind can be very much involved in that too. And so we talk about mental purification in Sufism too, because we can think up, or we can take what should be a spiritual imagination and we can make it a purely intellectual or mental imagination, and then believe that it's real. And so it is a combination of various traits we have in us. So I didn't want to give the impression it's just the ego, but the ego is very much part of it, because why not create a God that lets your ego do what it wants? Isn't that the most convenient sort of thing you can have? I've talked sometimes to Latter-day Saints who, because I dealt with the Middle East, would say some pretty terrible things about people in other parts of the world, like we should just bomb them back to the Stone Age. And I go, didn't Jesus say? And they go, yeah, but he was talking about people who could be saved, not just anybody that we should be kind to. And I'm going, well, there's a God ideal. Excuse me, there's a God ideal.
That sounds like an ego projection to me, Sheikh.
It's a power projection. And, and I'm just kind of going, I think Jesus said what Jesus said. I think I need to figure out what the wisdom Jesus is dispensing to me, not try to say, well, my ego says it'd be great to destroy the people I hate with bombs. So I find this all the time. Well, yes, everybody's a child of God, but not them, that kind of thinking. And I think that we create a God that allows us to excuse the people we don't like, when Jesus very clearly did not want us to do that.
Well, I think they are always the problem, aren't they? Isn't that the problem, that we imagine that they are the problem, when really it's ego that's the problem? And I think not only did Jesus say what Jesus said, but Jesus meant what Jesus said.
Yeah. Unless my ego doesn't like it, then I just create a Jesus that does. I pull out in my own image and likeness. Yeah.
That's right. Who was it? Wasn't it Voltaire who said, God created man in his image, and man has been trying to return the favor ever since?
Yes, that's right. Yes. So, this God ideal problem is forever with us. And that's why if I'm to be a true mystic, a true Sufi, I have to doubt myself. I can't just accept my ideas at face value. I've got to explore them and make sure that they're pure. and that I'm not doing things for the wrong reasons, and convincing myself that I'm righteous when in fact I may be doing something terrible.
For me, this reminds me of how on our sister podcast on Latter-day Peace Studies Presents Come Follow Me, Ben and I have chosen a hermeneutic, which means the lens through which we're going to interpret the scriptures, what we call exegesis, right? We've chosen this cruciform hermeneutic. If somebody in the Old Testament thought God was a warrior God, or everyone in the Old Testament thought God was a warrior God, and we see Jesus, who is not warring, but rather dying, right? He's not a
Right.
Roman. He's sort of the anti-Roman, right? The Roman idea is peace through victory. Jesus's idea is peace through justice. And so I'm going to look to Jesus, and I'm going to check everything else I read against Jesus, against that cruciform hermeneutic. And then I'm going to focus in, of course, as we always do, on the central teachings of Jesus, the Beatitudes.
Right. Exactly. And of course, the entire Sermon on the Mount that follows says many of those things. Go the extra mile. If they ask for a coat, give them a cloak. It's replete. His message is replete with that. And I would have probably said, instead of justice, I would have said victory through peace.
Yes.
And I'm not trying to correct that or anything, but I would just say that that's what the Beatitudes are saying. Be peacemakers.
Right.
And
I'm not
that
attached
means
to peace through justice. That's something I borrowed from John Dominic Crossan. And I get it. And I get what you're saying too. Yeah.
so any rate, yeah, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but let's talk one last minute about what this means when we say, this external figure we call Satan is Shaitan, yes, is if existent, irrelevant, because the only power that Satan would have is the power that I give to that Satan. And so it's still me who is the giver. It is still me that is the determiner. It is my agency that makes the difference in how this will go. It's my agency that moves me toward satisfying the flesh, or my agency that moves me toward moving in the direction of the soul. And so it's still me. And that's why for many Sufis, myself included, we use the term shaitani. And from your Arabic, you know what shaitani means.
My Satan.
My Satan.
The only one relevant to me.
The only one relevant to me. And this is the personification we give to the impulse to yield to the flesh.
And this reminds me of the shadow self, as Jung expressed it, at least as I understand it. And so in some sense, what that gives me, right, if there is a comparison that can be drawn between the shadow self of Carl Jung and Shaitani, my Satan, then that means that what that tells me is, tell me if I'm wrong, that means I have to integrate in some sense that Shaitani, right? I can't get rid of it. I have to accept it. And somehow, but I can't just accept it as is. I have to somehow integrate it. And so it occurs to me that the Prophet Muhammad has a saying, right? What we call a hadith, where he says that he made his, because he was asked, does he have a shaitan, right? Isn't that how it goes?
Yeah, there's the story told of Muhammad having a shaitan.
Right, and he says, yeah. But I made him a Muslim. I converted him. In other words, I made my Satan submit to God.
So this shows the role of the law. He used the law, as he understood it, to get Satan to surrender, Muslim, one who surrenders. And so his internal conflict between the flesh and the spirit, between his shaitani and his nafs, between his Satan and his soul, is resolved by bringing the ego into the service of the soul.
Isn't it interesting from a nonviolent standpoint that even Satan isn't annihilated, right? I mean, Satan is incorporated somehow. Satan is converted in that way. And by the way, that reminds me of a question that I think is a deep theological question. We don't have to go into, but I'll just leave it to the listener to ponder. Can Satan be redeemed? If there is a capital S Satan?
We are going to talk about that definitely when we come to some of our topics, because
All right.
that is one of the things in Sufism. That's a big one. My Satan is the Satan that truly matters, and not so much the external personality or being. So whether there is an external personage that is Satan, or whether it is a metaphor for my soul, or my flesh gaining traction over my soul, as Paul would say it, that I give in to the desires of the flesh in opposition to those of the soul. Whether that's true or not is not nearly as relevant as how I deal with my soul internally. And I would say there's two ways I can view phena'a, this final stage of annihilating the ego. One of them is that the ego is so subsumed in the soul that it ceased to have any independent existence.
That's another instance of integration, right? It's not destroyed; it's integrated, fully integrated, because it's a part of ourselves, right? We cannot get rid of it. We just have to put things in order. We're talking about ordering the soul, aren't we? I'm thinking of Plato here. I don't know if it's the same idea in Sufism, right? There's this idea of ordering the soul such that things are in their proper place, right? Where the higher self is above the lower self, where shaitan submits to the law, right? My shaitan, I should say, shaitani.
Yes, I think that's, and this is one of the reasons that as a Sufi and a mystic, I love Plato, right? Because as I'm reading this, I'm going, this guy talks like a mystic. What he's teaching is mystical teaching. And it shows again the many paths of mystical teaching that have existed throughout humanity's, 7,000-year civilizational run.
I was in a conversation this morning about how the work of Peter Kingsley shows that the beginnings of Western philosophy are mystical, right? Parmenides and Empedocles are mystics. They're not rationalists. And that somehow this thing takes a wrong turn, right? And it just becomes this hyper-rational project, but that's not what it was in the beginning. And so I think, if we can go back to that, we don't even have to go to the East, which there's nothing wrong with I look to the East for wisdom, but we can go back into our own tradition, back into the beginning of it, and find these teachings.
Absolutely. They've been there the whole time. The texts of our scriptures are filled with this, but we have to unlearn what we think we know to see what had always been there. When I'm saying not subject to the law, if it is a process where the ego becomes fully integrated into the soul, then we're not subject to the law anymore, because we are truly led by the soul. So back to
Paul. We're not
Paul,
under the law,
English.
We're under our soul.
That's exactly right. That's exactly correct.
This has been such a fruitful conversation. Sheikh. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. I've gotten so much more out of these few verses than I got when I probably glossed over them entirely reading through the chapter. Even though I try to study and read carefully and study deeply. And Ben and I, on our sister podcast on Latter-day Contemplation, on Latter-day Peace Studies Presents Come Follow Me, go into a lot more detail about the week's reading, right? We don't just talk about a few verses. And so in some sense, it isn't surprising to me that we miss some depth, and it just shows me that there's so much depth to mine, so much wisdom to be found, and we can really pan for gold in these texts and find it, and that we can alchemize our souls and turn them into spiritual gold, and that we can learn how through these texts.
They're there to guide us. And Paul is almost desperate to get this message out. You can just hear it in him. He's on it again and again, because it's his personal message. It's what he discovered on the road to Damascus. It's what he brought out of this. I thought the law was everything, and now I know the law isn't everything. Now what am I going to do?
Right.
It just blew my whole world order out the window. Now what I'm going to do. And so it's replete with
That's
it.
an ego annihilation, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, because he had to set aside his Pharisaism, which was his whole life.
Which is all ego, by the way, right? That's very egoic. And I think, I don't think we are immune from that kind of thinking. We like to talk about the Pharisees as though, again, that's them, right? That's their problem. It's funny. It's always been funny to me how in our tradition, we do the same thing with the Ramyamton story. Oh, those silly people, that story is not about them. It's about us. You should come to, when you come to visit, Sheikh, you listen to my children pray and tell me if they don't sound you just hear the same thing over and over again. I've taken time with my children to try to have them to at least, let's take a few breaths intentionally before we pray, right? Just slow down a minute and think about what we're doing. Yeah. And I actually find more value sometimes, well, oftentimes, especially if I'm going to get a Ramyamton prayer after a few breaths anyway, right? So I find more value in the breaths than in the words of the prayers, right? Because it just gives me a moment to center and to pause. What is the point of praying before a meal? It's to express gratitude. Well, where does the gratitude we're expressing comes from? We have to feel it.
Or is it pro forma?
Or is it pro forma? Exactly right. Are we just checking off a box?
That's right. I have to pray before I eat. So
that's right.
The old Cub Scout joke of rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, amen. I mean, yeah, I guess you did pray, but we're just kids. I'm not trying to pick on kids, but I am saying.
Well, but we're talking here about maturing spiritually. That's why it's fitting, right? If I'm doing the same thing, and by the way, I have been guilty of doing the same thing.
Oh, of course.
Then I'm spiritually a child too, right?
One of my projects is just to try to be present during the passing of the sacrament and the prayers. And I do it on occasion, but I really try to just say, is this a serious thing for me? Am I really here because this is for me? Or did some bread go by and I had a piece, and some water go by and I had a sip, and I'm really worried about something else, and it's ghafla, heedlessness, distraction. They're with us all the time. And part of what we do with breathing with Sufis is to give us breath consciousness, which ties us back into our soul and into the divineness. So, yeah, that's why I gave you this centering breath exercise we do that can be done anywhere at any time to try to pull us back into a spiritual space. So, well, I think, again, this has been very fruitful. I'm very grateful for it. I learned so much in conversing with you, and I not only that, I learned so much about you and your desires and your soul, and it's beautiful to converse soul to soul. So I hope we can ponder on our soul, as Paul said. Let us, let the soul win out. Let the soul win out. And then finally, you're going to find yourself not worrying so much about the rules and the law, because you would do that anyway. Your soul wants to do that anyway. And so if you're in the soul, you're already going to do that and much, much, much more.
Amen and amen.
Okay.
Thank you again, Master, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, and you're welcome. And I'll see you next week.
Peace be with you. Ma'as-salama.
Ma'as-salama. Peace be with you.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Contemplation Presents Come Follow Me. Once again, I'm your co-host, Christopher Hurtado. Please also consider listening to Latter-day Peace Studies' other podcasts I co-host, Latter-day Contemplation, offering a contemplative approach to discipleship, and Latter-day Peace Studies Presents Come Follow Me, offering nonviolent historical critical exegesis of Latter-day Saint Scripture at www.latterdaypeacestudies.org.
Once again, I'm Dr. David Peck. Please also consider listening to my other podcast of Saints and Sufis, Musings of a Mormon Mystic, offering Sufi meditations and commentary through my The Truth of Jesus is Himself series at www.daviddpeck.com.
Thank you for co-hosting this podcast with me, Sheikh Dawood. Thanks also to Latter-day Peace Studies all-volunteer team for editing, publishing, and promoting this podcast on social media. Finally, thanks to our audience for listening and responding to this podcast and for donating to Latter-day Peace Studies, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. All of your donations are tax-deductible and go toward producing, publishing, and distributing content.
And thank you for co-hosting this podcast with me, Abdul Haq. Till next week.